Welcome to the channel, I'm Tom, this is my table, and on my table today we have the parts for a £650/$650-ish gaming PC that will aid you on your quest to save Super Earth.
Nice moves. Where'd you learn how to do that, soldier?
So as well as helping save Super Earth, I'll also go through the parts and I'll show you how to put this together and just show you how easy it is.
I shouldn't have said that. I should not have said that.
Starting off with the parts then, I used the Intel i5-13400F, not the one that you're seeing on screen because this one is the i3-12100F, but I did have to use this CPU in order to update the BIOS on the motherboard that we were going to be using, and you can see how to do that on a video on the channel. And yeah, I decided to use the Intel i5-13400F over the 12400F just because this machine's going to do a little bit of editing as well. As for the motherboard then, we had the MSI Pro H610MB DDR4 motherboard. And this is one of the parts where you have to make a bit of compromises when you're going for a budget build. And so I decided to go with this board. I wouldn't pair it with a much higher power draw CPU than the one that we used, but if you are looking for a cheaper board, there is the H610ME version of this board, and it's actually a little bit better just because it does have an extra fan header on it. For our memory then, I went for the Patriot Viper Steel 16GB kit, which is 2x 8GB 3200MHz DDR4 sticks, and the reason I went for this is the 3200MHz speed is the max that our motherboard supports. It's got decent latency as CL16, and DDR4 is nice and affordable now. You could also upgrade this to a 32GB kit for probably another £20 or so. And now for our storage, I went for the crucial P3 500GB M.2 Nvme, and to be honest, I probably should have just got a terabyte drive for an extra £10, but I just wanted to save as much money as I could. But in hindsight, I should have gone for the 1TB drive. It's not a PCIe Gen 4, it's PCIe Gen 3, but it's still plenty fast enough for what we need it for. And now for one of our main events, we have the Intel Arc A750, and I wanted to revisit Arc because of the driver updates that just keep coming and making this series of card better and better each time. And yeah, I think it's a good time to revisit and see what it can do. And this card also helps to keep the cost of this PC pretty damn low. For our power supply then, I've gone for the CIT FX Pro 700W 80+ bronze rated unit, and while this might be a bit of a compromise because it is a fairly cheap power supply, I don't think we're going to be getting near that 700W max that it can output, so we should be fine with that and it should be doing just fine in our build. And finally, what's going to be housed in our build, we have the iONZ Pro Gamer Edition KZ-35V Zenith Black Micro ATX case, and this is where the build maybe will have a little bit of problems. It was very nice and cheap, but as you're going to see, it was a little bit of a nightmare to build in. There is like a mesh like print here almost on the glass, which is really odd. Like from the pictures, I thought that the glass, the actual glass came down to around here, and then you had the mesh under here, so you had some ventilation going in through the bottom. But that's not the case. It's just made to look like that, which concerns me a little bit for the temperatures. But looking on this side, there is a little bit of ventilation where air still can get in here. Whether that's going to be enough though, I'm not sure. We'll have to see what the temperatures are like. So here's the completed build that should get us filing for democracy, and I didn't actually show any of the footage of me putting this together just because, like Hagrid said, I should not have said it, it wasn't that easy or straightforward to put this build together just because this case was a little bit of a nightmare to actually build in, and there's a couple reasons for that. So number one is that there was no motherboard tray. So there was no space behind the motherboard to actually put any cables, really. I mean, there was slightly raised motherboard standoffs, which I really had to try squeeze some wires behind it so it wasn't an absolute mess of a system. But it was just incredibly time consuming to try get it just right so I could actually put the motherboard in. In terms of cable tie positions, there's only 4 in the entire case, 2 right at the top which were pressed really close to the motherboard, and 2 right on the right hand side, which again, not really much space to do anything with. And since they were so close to the side panels, I barely had any room to actually try cable tie the cables, and with my fat fingers it was an even harder proposition to actually do that. So it was kind of a hard case to actually build it, I'm not gonna lie. Not much space at all. If you had an ITX motherboard, I think that would make it a lot easier. You might have also noticed a lack of RGB coming from the additional fans in this case, so 2 at the top, 1 at the rear and then 2 at the bottom, and that's because the cables provided with the stock fans in this case weren't actually long enough to reach the RGB header on the motherboard that I used, so you would have to get a RGB controller to actually make this light up. So while at the end of it, I think this is a fairly nice case and build. I wouldn't actually recommend it if you're new to building PCs, just because the actual management of trying to get everything to fit perfectly was a bit annoying. Democracy for Super Earth. So yeah, now we're in Helldivers 2, and just going into the menu, on our display settings we're at 1080p and we're at the native render scale, and then moving on to graphics we're on the high preset, but I have made a few tweaks. Most notably I've turned depth of field off, and then I have also gone and toggled off the anti-aliasing, just because on this game I don't think it's implemented very well and I think it just makes things look a bit too blurry. So let's see how we perform in game. Landed on the planet, then you can see that we managed to hold just about low 60s, mid 60s in terms of FPS, and yeah, it's looking pretty good on the high preset. In terms of temperature, we are sitting just below 70 degrees on the graphics card, and the CPU is actually below 50, so that aftermarket cooler that we got for around £20 is doing a really good job. And even after a little bit of gameplay, the GPU is still holding just under 70 degrees, and again the CPU under 50, with the FPS staying in the mid 60s. I have played on a few different planets, and it does depend on the planet what FPS you get, but this is pretty much typical. On 1080p I didn't really see it drop below 60 FPS in any sort of scenario, except for there was a map with the automatons where there was absolutely hellfire going on, and it dropped to maybe like 58, so you're not really gonna dip below the 60s at 1080p unless you're not doing your job as a Helldiver properly. Moving on to 1440p, we've kept the graphics exactly the same at the high preset with depth of field off and anti-aliasing off, and now at 1440p we do manage to hold on to the mid 40s in terms of frame rate, sometimes going into the low 50s, but I never saw a dip below 40 FPS at the high settings for this game, even when there was a lot going on with a lot of explosions, and even on the maps of the automatons we never dipped below that 40 FPS, so it's done pretty well. In terms of heat, again for this case, it's actually done a lot better than I thought it would. I never saw the GPU go above 72 degrees, and to be fair, the CPU I haven't seen it go above 55 degrees, so yeah, I'm pretty impressed with the airflow that this case is actually given, considering it is pretty limited. But then again, these parts aren't the most power hungry. And now that I've done my part for democracy, let's move on to the benchmarks.